Hey guys, Alec Torelli from Conscious Poker. In this video, you're going to learn about the 7 mistakes to mostly avoid at the poker table. Now, before we jump in, these are all general guidelines. There are times when each one of these could have its own place, but by and large, for most players, most of the time, you're going to want to avoid these 7 things if you want to make more money playing poker. The first one of them is limping. If you have a hand that's strong enough to play, you should almost always come in for a raise. And if you're unsure of what to do because you're not sure whether your hand justifies a raise or not, the better play, the more prudent play is just to fold. And the reason for that is because if a hand is ambiguous, it probably means it's not that good of a hand. It's not a great opportunity. The hands that you know are worth playing, you don't have to question or ask whether or not you should play them. You should simply just raise with them. Another thing you want to consider is always keep your raise size the same amount so that your opponents can't figure out what you have based on your raise size. But avoid limping. It opens up a whole bunch of doors to getting exploited and outplayed. Number 2 is discussing strategy at the table. You generally want to avoid doing this. It's not like it makes people better at poker necessarily. It does, but there are other reasons why you don't want to do this as well. The obvious one is it maybe can make people better. But number 2 is that it gives people insight into what you are actually thinking. So there's a lot of times in poker where I'm unsure of what level someone else is on. I'm trying to get a read on them and how they think about the game. And they'll make a comment like, "Oh, I knew you couldn't have that hand there." And I say, "Oh, okay, well, now I understand how this person is thinking about the game because he's thinking not only about his range, he's thinking about the other player's range, and therefore you automatically know what kind of level they're on." So even a very subtle comment about strategy can give people a clue into what and how you're thinking, and that's why it's so detrimental. The other reason why is because it helps people, it makes people in a mindset where they want to play better. So I didn't say that the best way possible. It basically puts people in a frame of mind where they are now thinking about playing the game better instead of keeping the atmosphere and the energy a lot more fun at the table. Now, of course, there are times where strategy is inevitable. It's obviously a natural topic of poker at the table, but just be mindful of how things you are saying impact what the other people are thinking, especially people that aren't saying anything. Those are the ones paying the most attention. All right, number 3 is playing offsuit hands. Now, you typically want your hands to be suited. There are exceptions to this rule when you have very strong premium hands like ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, stuff like that. Those hands can be justified playing offsuit. But by and large, most of the situations you're going to face in a poker table, you want to have suited hands. Of course, if you're on the button and you're raising or you're defending in the big blind, fine. Those are exceptions to the rules where you can have offsuit hands. You're going to raise with queen-jack offsuit on the button. Obviously, that's fine. But if you are facing a raise and you're calling a raise, especially in the earlier positions, or you're raising yourself in the earlier positions, or you're calling 3 bets, those are the situations where it gets a lot more dicey to have offsuit hands. And you're definitely going to want to have something like a suited hand almost always, unless you have a pair. Hand, like calling a 3-bet in position with a hand like 9-10 suited is far better than calling a 3-bet in position with king-jack offsuit. Yes, king-jack offsuit is a better hand, but the hand doesn't play as well in a re-raised pot when you're very deep, because if you flop a pair, you have what's called reverse implied odds, meaning it's much more likely that you're going to lose a big pot than you're going to win a big pot. Whereas if you have 9-10, you flop middle pair or something like that, you're probably not going to lose a big pot with that hand. You're not going to get married to your middle pair. It's kind of easy to get away from it. But there's a lot of hands that 9-10 suited could flop that could bust a lot bigger of a hand, or you could be drawing to hands that can make a lot better of a hands. So you want to play suited hands most often in poker. That's a great framework to keep in mind. Number 4 is you want to avoid chasing draws on the turn, especially when you're out of position. So if you're going to be playing your hand as a draw, you want to be the one betting, you want to be the aggressor, or you want to be in position. Now, this is pretty significant because when you're out of position and you're check calling, the only way to win the pot is to improve to the best hand. So the only way you can win is by making your draw. Well, you're out of position, there's one card to come, you're a big underdog to improve to the best hand. So it's typically a losing proposition to be drawing when out of position, especially on the turn. Now, when you're in position and you're drawing, it's a lot different because when you're in position and you're drawing, well, if your opponent checks the river, now you can bluff. You have to be careful here because a lot of people will put you on a missed draw and call you down. So you could end up compounding that mistake of calling the turn because you're going to lose more money on the river. But also when you're in position, if you hit your draw, you can see what your opponent does. Maybe your draw is very deceptive. Maybe he bets out and then you raise him and you win 2 bets, or he checks and you bet when you hit your draw and you win an extra bet. When you're out of position, if you hit your draw, you check, your opponent just checks behind. And if you bet when the draw gets there, it's kind of obvious that you have what you have. It's hard to get paid off, right? Or maybe you get raised by a better flush, if the flush draw came or something like that. So it's very dicey to play these draws out of position. And so you want to keep that in mind when you are drawing in no limit. The fifth thing you want to avoid, and I see this very often with clients, coaching, or just people when I'm watching people play poker, one of the most common mistakes, I think, is playing too many hands from the small blind. And people like to think, oh, I'm in the pot, or there's only one person behind me, I'm just going to call a raise. The small blind is the worst position to play a hand from. So you typically want to have pretty strong hands if you're coming in the small blind. You want to have hands that play very well post-flop if you're going to call a raise. The best times to call raises in the small blind is when other people are in the pot as well. So if it goes raise, call, call, and you have a hand in the small blind, okay, calling is a little bit better because you're getting great odds and there's other people in the pot. It's a little bit more acceptable to call in that spot. But typically if you're facing a single raise, especially from late position, if you're in the small blind, you want to either re-raise with your hand and you want to choose a bigger sizing because you're raising from out of position. So you want to steal with your hand, or you want to just fold. It kind of comes back to the same principle we talked about before. When you're calling a bet out of position, you don't control the tempo of the hand, and the only way to win the pot is to make the best hand. You're calling out of position, so you're not going to take the lead and start bluffing, and you're not going to win the pot unless you hit a hand, right? Because you don't have the lead in the hand. Whereas if you 3-bet pre-flop, well, now you have the lead in the hand. Number one, your opponent can just fold, and you win the pot right away. Number two, if you miss your hand, you can bet the flop because now you have the initiative, you have the range advantage. You started to put the balance of power back in your favor with a 3-bet pre-flop, so you're representing the strong hands like aces, kings, queens, etc. So you could win the pot post-flop with a c-bet because you're the one with the lead and the initiative. Number three, you could still hit your hand, right? You still could hit your hand and win the pot that way. So you have 3 ways to win your hand when you're 3-betting pre, and you only have 1 way to win your hand when you're calling pre. So it kind of like 3x's your possibilities of winning. So that's a simple way to think about it. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but you want to keep this in mind when you're playing hands out of position in the small blind. Most people play way too many hands. This is the position you want to be the tightest from. You should be folding almost everything, even hands that feel like this hand is probably better than their hand. Why am I folding here? That's a common feeling. You should most often be folding in the small blind. Okay, so number 6 is playing big pots out of position. There are times, I have to like kind of preface every rule with the exception because otherwise the rail's gonna yell at me. There are times where you're gonna check call big bets out of position and you're gonna bluff catch. There are times when you do that, okay? So there are times when you just have a strong read, or you know the guy's bluffing, or you have such a strong hand that you have to call, or you have great blockers, like whatever it is. There's gonna be times when you check call out of position and you call down for your stack. Most of the time, it's not a great position to be in. It's very hard for the average player to play well in this spot, right? Think about it. You bet the flop, you check call the turn, and you check call like all in on the river. It's very hard to be right. Most of the time you have a bluff catcher. Most of the time you don't know where they're at. They're repping all the strong hands. It's a very dicey spot to be in. So you typically want to avoid these spots, especially in 3-bet pots when you just, this is kind of why you don't want to play offsuit hands pre-flop, like especially trouble hands or hands that have reverse applied odds like king jack, because you flop a pair, you check call the flop, then they bet again. Now they're repping ace king, they're repping aces. You're check calling the turn, just hoping they don't have what they're repping, and then you're check calling the river, hoping they don't have what they're repping. So sure, you could win money doing that, and some of the time it almost feels, you might relate to this, it might feel like you're kind of flipping a coin and just praying that they're bluffing, right? You're just kind of hoping. Whereas you want to be in spots where you have high degree of conviction when you're putting in a lot of chips. So you want to control the action, you want to control the tempo of the hand, and you want to have like high conviction, strong certainty when you're playing very big pots. So it's not to say you can't win a big pot out of position, but typically playing big pots out of position in no limit hold'em especially is a very dicey proposition. So you want to avoid that. All right, the final thing you want to avoid, number 7, is kind of the same principle, but in a different way, is calling down for your tournament life. Now, this is a mistake I see quite often, and it comes back to the principle of tournament strategy. So in tournament poker, fold equity, right? You being the one that's the aggressor is, I don't know if it's exponentially, but it's definitely it is dramatically bigger of a factor than in a cash game, okay? And the reason it's a bigger factor is because the economics of tournaments, the way tournaments fundamentally work. The way tournaments fundamentally work is the value of your existing stack is worth a certain amount. And increasing the amount of chips you have doesn't proportionally increase the value of your stack. So if you have 10,000 chips and your stack is worth $10,000, if you go to 20,000 chips, your stack is not worth $20,000. It might be worth $15,000. So the asymmetry, the risk reward, is usually to the downside, unless you're the chip leader. Because the additional chips you have aren't worth as much as the previous chips. But when you have a middling stack, which is most of the time, again, this is like general advice for most people most of the time. Most of the time, you don't have a chip lead in a tournament. Most of the time, you have a middling stack. And when you have a middling stack, the risk reward of you risking all of your chips in a marginal spot when you're calling down, hoping the guy is bluffing, is not very good. You want to be the one shoving. You want to be the one putting them to the test. You want to be the one that's aggressive. Because when you're the one that's aggressive, they're in the same risk reward proposition that you were just in the previous example. They're the one thinking, well, if I call all in and lose, I'm out of the tournament, but if I fold, I can just wait for the next hand. And that's a good risk reward equation for other people. They're going to typically bow down to that and fold, which is why you see aggressive players winning a lot of pots without showdown. So you want to be the one that's the aggressor, putting them to the decision for a lot of their chips, and you don't want to be the caller and calling down, hoping that someone else is bluffing. So which one of these tips was your favorite? I talk a lot more about these tips in our membership at Conscious Poker. It's at consciouspoker.com/member. We also have a free newsletter at consciouspoker.com too, where we put out tips every single week in our Crush Mondays newsletter, as well as our latest content here on YouTube or social media, wherever you're watching this. You'll get access to that as well. So check that out at consciouspoker.com. Let me know some more poker tips in the comments too. Always looking to learn from you guys, and appreciate everyone's support. Subscribe to the channel. Awesome content's coming. See you in the next one.